I interviewed all of the politicians and the people in Washington that I knew, lots of people that many people would know their names. I called them and asked them their views of civility and how they perceived all that in politics. And kind of what I came to the conclusion of was there really was no such thing as political civility ever. That it was an oxymoron in
Mm.
truth. So but it made me a little sad, and I thought, boy, I could write a whole book about this subject.
Shelby Scarbrough is an entrepreneur and author. She worked numerous years in government as a political appointee in the Reagan and Bush administrations, as well as for the State Department. There, she learned how diplomats and civil leaders of various cultures communicate to develop long-lasting relationships. After politics, she started her own business where she worked with renowned names such as Nelson Mandela, Pope John Paul II, and President Wałęsa of Poland. With her extensive experience, she has first-hand knowledge that she now shares in her latest book named Civility Rules. In this episode, Shelby breaks down what civility is, why we struggle with it, and how we as individuals can make changes to create a more civil society. Thank you for joining. Enjoy the episode. Shelby Scarbrough, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so excited to have you here. Why don't you start off by please introducing yourself and tell me your story?
Well, my name is Shelby. I've been writing a book for a little while here, but long before I started writing books, I was involved in government, in political appointments in the federal government, and then I started a business and became an entrepreneur. And they were all focused around handling dignitaries. So I worked in the White House Presidential Advance Office, helping coordinate the events of President Reagan, and all around the world, and even in the building, even in the White House, and anywhere he needed to go. I was part of a team of about 14 full-time staff members, and then a lot of other people we called volunteer advanced people that were deployed all over the world whenever we needed a team. And then I went to the State Department as a protocol officer, helping the visitors to the White House, the kings, queens, prime ministers, and foreign ministers, whoever came to town, we helped them get through their paces. So I like to think that what we did was take out some of the noise of the logistics so that they could focus on the substance of what they were trying to accomplish. And then when I started a business, I sort of did what I knew how to do, which was handle dignitaries. So I started out with some fun big name clients, which really helped me get going. The first was Nelson Mandela. The next was Pope John Paul II. And the third was Lech Wałęsa of Poland. So those were kind of fun to get my feet wet in my own business and go on from there.
I don't think many people can say that those clients were some of the first clients in anyone's business. That is an incredible business that you were starting there.
Well, I felt very fortunate. I was referrals, I never
Mhm.
advertised, started a business in a day and age when the internet wasn't so robust, and there wasn't a lot of easy ways to get the word out. So it had to be by reputation and by referral. And so I feel very gratified and satisfied that hopefully that people recommended me for the job.
So you're saying you did not run a Facebook ad in South Africa to get okay. Good to know.
Exactly.
Good to know.
No such
That's
thing.
incredible. What was the inspiration for the book that we're going to be talking about today, Civility Rules? Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, because most of my professional world dealt with diplomacy and international relations and cross-cultural relations, I've always been a student of this kind of discussion of how do we communicate with each other? How do we get to know each other and break down the barriers between us in order to form a long-term lasting relationship? And so, there's some basic concepts for interpersonal communication that come along with that. But the word civility sort of stood out to me. And then I was contacted by somebody who was putting a kind of a compendium together, a book of people, various authors writing different chapters, and the book was called The Power of Civility. So my chapter was about political civility. And as I wrote the chapter, I interviewed all of the politicians and the people in Washington that I knew, lots of people that many people would know their names. I called them and asked them their views of civility and how they perceived all that in politics. And kind of what I came to the conclusion of was there really was no such thing as political civility ever. That it was an oxymoron in
Mm,
truth. So but it made me a little sad, and I thought, boy, I could write a whole book about this subject, not just a chapter. And that's sort of what got me going on the process.
that's great. As you know, I shared a little bit before we started this recording that civility is near and dear to the listeners here, as well as me. Um, can you go into a little bit more detail about how you define civility? Is civility simply the lack of uncivil behavior, or is it also the presence of certain behavior?
Yes, that's a really good way to put it. I look at it as the presence of a lot of things, of trust, respect, honor, dignity, treating people with dignity, and living a life of humility. The bottom line is that it forms. There are some certain characteristics that I discovered by looking through a um, George Washington's Rules of Civility. I took his book and I broke it out into literally a spreadsheet, this 110 rules of civility. And I looked at all of those, and they were kind of funny. They sound awkward to us now because they're in older English, and some of the things, the specifics don't really match up with our lives today. But when you take them apart, when you dissect them a bit, what you find is they come down to these core values of trust and respect, humility, honor, um, empathy. And then the other one that is really most associated with civility in people's minds is courtesy. And then the subset of that being manners. So we think of civility at a superficial level as being polite. That sort of just the one word, being polite. But for me, it's so much more than that. It's about character values of how you show up in the world, how we respect other people, how we build trust with other people, and how we walk with humility and grace, even though we may be very accomplished in life, or we may feel that we know everything. But the best way, in my mind, is to step back and accept that we don't know everything. We just think we do sometimes, and to accept the fact that we can be lifelong learners and walk through life with humility.
Well said. I want to touch on something that you've already mentioned, looking back at history, thinking about civility through a political civility lens. Can you talk about the state of civility in the United States? Is this level of incivility normal looking back historically?
Um, it changes with time. So just kind of like a bridge, kind of like the bridge, it connects two sides. I think of the Golden Gate Bridge whenever I think of this imagery, is that it connects two sides of land together to bring people and things and places together that were not connected before. But over the bridge, the bridge has looked the same ever since it was built, and it does the same function. It gets us from here to there. But the cars on the bridge are what change, the styles of the cars. And so the style of what is civil, when it comes especially to manners, change over time. But the initial core concepts of human interaction and human connection and civil society, and the concept of civil society has been pretty stable forever. It's just that we've gotten off our mark on it, and we're not really using those qualities too much anymore.
I see. I like the analogy with the cars and how certain things have changed, but at its core, we're looking for certain features, some certain aspects of civility. What do you see when you look into the future for the U.S.? Are there going to be different cars as they were in the past? How do you think where do you think we're going to go from here?
Well, if Elon Musk has anything to do with it, or all these creative geniuses out there who come up with new ideas, yes, it's always going to be evolving. But with that evolution comes responsibility and reflection to make sure that we don't forget to use the analogy of the cars, that we don't forget what the Model T looked like. We don't forget our history, because we got from there to here for a reason. And if we forget ourselves in that process, that's where we lose. That's where everybody loses. So I think that's where I believe so much in the civics education. And I'm on the board of an organization called the Freedoms Foundation at Valley Forge, which teaches civics to high school students and junior high students, grammar school students, and high school teachers. And it teaches the foundations of our country's founding so that we can have context, so that we can understand what our original mission and purpose was. And we can debate a lot of things. There's good, there's bad, and there's ugly in our history. But the founding of our country was very unique and very special. And if we want to keep this democracy, if we want to keep the spirit of what America is about alive in its truest essence, absent of all the drama and the trials and tribulations and the, I'd say, trauma again, of the things that we've gone through in our history to get to this point in history, if we forget all of that and erase it, then we are the less for it, for sure.
Many lessons to be learned from our forefathers. I want to think about the weight and importance of civility from a different angle. What are the consequences of civility or lack thereof?
Well, we see it in a lot of people look immediately to the internet, and I think that's a low hanging fruit in this discussion, because it's obvious that that has caused a lot of disruption in so many ways. In many ways, amazing. I mean, we're able to do this virtually. We're able to do so many wonderful things with technology, but there is a consequence to everything, and society needs to learn to adapt to certain things. So what I'm hoping for, and remember, hope is not a strategy, it's not a plan, but one of the things that I try to reach for is to say that we've had to learn how to use this new tool. And maybe there's a greater awareness now in the fact that it can be very damaging if used in the wrong way, and that there are plenty of ways it's being used in the wrong way right now. There will always be ways it's going to be used in the wrong way. But if each individual person, if each parent tries to teach their child about the right way to engage with the internet and social media, meaning stay true to their value systems, don't spend too much time on it, because that's about looking at what other people think, right? It's not about not caring what people think, but it's not about spending your whole time worrying about what other people think, but rather focusing on your own personal development and how you can be a great contributor to this world, how I can contribute in a positive way to this world, not what the internet is bouncing around with clickbait. And this is the kind of stuff that does get in our way. It's noise, though. It's clutter, as a friend of mine would say. And for us to be able to discern how to pick our way through that and look at take the good and work with the good, and really shut off the stuff that's not so healthy for us.
Hmm. I want to look at the word civility and how it's been used, generally speaking, in different contexts. Civility, the word and its related forms, has been given a bad rap in some circles, alluding to conquerors and colonists who justify their rule given their quote unquote civil nature versus barbarians. For example, Francis Parkman, a famous 19th century American historian, even claimed that the American Indian will not learn, quote unquote, the arts of civilization, and he and his forest must perish together, end quote. I know we're moving into uncivil territory for a topic of civility, but I wonder, how do you think about this issue and the history of the word civility?
So in my mind, that's a perversion of the idea. So if we go back to the beginning of time, there was civilized society in the sense of people had to work together. The tribal communities around this world from the beginning of time to now have very sophisticated communication strata within their tribes. They have very sophisticated ways of working with one another so that they can get along in a kind of a collective environment. And they do it with governance, with their own kind of governance. They do it with tradition. They do it with civility. So for me, there's been examples of civility that don't have to do with modern technology or anything like that. It's about how we communicate with each other. So we, as civilized people, quote unquote, could learn a lot from Margaret Mead and her study of ancient societies in the anthropological realm, because they knew how to get along together to survive. It was much a matter of survival. For us, we have it pretty easy. And I know there's a lot of strife in the world, and I'm not discounting any of the things that are going on in this world where people don't have food, people don't have homes, they're struggling right now economically. That's not the point. The point is, most of the people in this world are have more time on their hands, especially in the United States. And we almost have too much time in our hands to be able to complain to one another about things that aren't really important. And we lose our way sometimes and lose our value system. Whereas when you had to worry about hunting and gathering, and you had a lot more life and death aspects on in front of you every single day, the really important things were the things that stuck, and everything else just washed away. Well, we have a lot more luxury of time because of the prosperity of this country, because of the prosperity of the world in general. We have more time on our hands, and that can be a dangerous thing.
Hmm. I want to think back to go back to some of the best practices and some of the applications of civility. I feel that one of the forces that combats civility is pride. I was reading your book that recently came out. Again, congratulations on Civility Rules. You've talked about working every job at Burger King despite being a UCLA grad, going on to work with some of the most influential people in the world that you already mentioned. And of course, like I just said, you authored a book. How do you think about pride as it applies to your life? And is pride always a negative?
No, because just like humility, pride is, pride is sort of right in the middle, I think. If you get into the biblical, pride cometh before a fall, then it could be conceived as negative. But I think of hubris as being the true negative, right? And so that's an abundance, overabundance of pride. And if you think of humility on a spectrum, pride's kind of in the middle. In other words, we have to have a healthy sense of ourself to be able to be really highly functional in this world. And I just had an experience where I went to lunch with my sixth grade teacher for the first time in, I won't even tell you how long, since I was in sixth grade. So, and I haven't seen him in a very long time. I've lived a life. He and his wife have lived a life. They've raised 3 children, have grandchildren, etc.
Wow, that's
It was such an
incredible.
experience to be able to tell him what he did for me, which was to actually, in a way, give me back some ego, because I had such a low self worth. I had so low self esteem. I didn't feel good about myself. And he helped me see that I had value. We have to
Hmm.
see ourselves as having value in this world to be even to function. If you don't, then there's a danger that we end up as a narcissist, because then you're just covering up all of your foibles with an exalted ego that's not healthy. But you have to have a healthy ego, and pride is part of that. Having pride in what you do, therefore doing a good job, therefore making sure you're thorough, taking it to the nth degree. And so that's why working at Burger King was a great experience for me. My parents taught me, well, don't be idle, look for things to do, have pride in your work, make sure that everything you touch is worthy of showing to the world. And that to me is a very healthy way to look at pride. And that's on the continuum of humility, where if you had no ego, no pride, no self-value, no self-worth, you're just a blob with takes up space. And the other side of that continuum is that hubris that is deadly and that inevitably ends, unfortunately. So we have
Hmm.
to have that balance.
I think that's well said. I also think about pride along the same lines as knowledge. You can be knowledgeable of yourself, you can be knowledgeable of the people that you represent. And if you don't have that sense of self worth or be able to feel proud of the accomplishments of you and your people, you'll have a hard time supporting them long term. It's not just about you necessarily, it's about the group that you associate with. But well said.
That also goes with humility, because we have to know what we don't know, right? That's the
Hmm.
core essence, is we know what we know, and we also know that we don't know everything. And
Sure.
that's that there's that when you get older, all of a sudden your parents get smarter. You realize, oh, maybe my parents actually did know a few things. And P.S., I probably have a few things I could learn. So I like to approach life as a lifelong learner, that everything is a learning experience. Talking to you today is a learning experience for me. Every single thing we do, if we look at it through the eyes of a student, has value, and it can add to that mosaic of who we are as people.
Absolutely. If you're still learning with all of the amazing experiences and accomplishments you've had, I hope that inspires everyone to put on their student cap. I want to bring it closer to home after talking about all these dignitaries from around the world. We just celebrated MLK Junior Day. I guess a couple weekends ago. Um, as you know, and as we've touched on, there is injustice in the world. And
Mhm.
as Martin Luther King Jr., Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. How do you recommend responding to injustice with this civility lens that you have? How do you approach that?
So primarily, I like to think of it as that injustice will not be helped by further injustices. So pendulum swings in how we behave to make up for something over here by swinging the pendulum completely the other way is not, I don't believe, is the way to go. And I think I say that intentionally, that I don't believe that. Now other people may disagree with me, and that's just perfectly fine. But from my perspective, the best way to counter injustice is to be aware of it, to understand what it looks like, to have empathy for other people, to be aware of your surroundings, to to know that you're not the only person in this world, and to just to put other people first all along the way. There's a lot of people out there trying to make big strides in that arena, but I think we can all do something about it individually. And that's what this book is about. It's about a personal practice of civility, because changing the world is a big, hairy, audacious goal. And some people definitely changed the world. I mean, I mentioned Musk. I mean, Gates. We know people who have literally changed the world, and changed every one of our worlds. But we can each do something to add value to this world, and that's the way I try to look at every day: is what am I doing today to bring joy and civility and add value to my place in this world, so that I am to use some business terminology, I'm a net add versus a net detractor in the world, in a better place. But I can't wave my wand and make everybody civil. That's not the way it works. But the way, if I practice my practice of civility, perhaps that will rub off on the next person I talk to, because maybe they'll think about their response to something a little longer versus making an initial judgment, or a pronouncement of something, which doesn't leave much room for conversation. When you say, I just can't believe those so and so's and that they believe this. Well, where do you have a conversation around that? It's more like, I I I can understand. I have a different viewpoint. I have a different perspective on that, but I can understand that somebody else might think differently than me.
Though it's really hard as someone that's aspiring to have those constructive conversations, to enter a conversation when someone starts off the topic like that. But I appreciate you sharing some of the best practices that you've had, and your take on at least trying.
Well, it's not, and then even then within that practice, because I experienced that, a lot. People say, "Oh my goodness, what about these people or this situation
Mhm.
or you? Isn't that awful?" And I say, "Well, we can look at it from different perspectives, and I try to look at things from both perspectives." And so when somebody begins a conversation with that, I actually go back to, and in my practice of civility, what I try to do is find out the place that we have commonality, and I'm very
100%.
about that. I talk about it as a process for me to say, what I'd like to find out is where we agree on the topic in common, and where we can
Mhm.
find that stasis, that we can start a conversation and know that we aren't enemies from the beginning, just because we might, and how much gray there is in the world. It's not all black
Mhm.
and white. Right now, the world seems to want to paint everything as black or white. And I just believe that the world is a lot more gray.
Yes. There's so much nuance in it, and you having worked in government, there might be someone that was originally in your party that voted your elected official into office, that has very strong feelings against what you're doing today. But there is nuance to it, and there's a long term vision as opposed to just short term effects. And
And everything
well
sound
said.
everything's a soundbite. We get sucked
Yep.
into that, both from the cable channels and the news channels, mostly the cable channels, that we look at, that if you have a particular political bent, you're going to hear things that you agree on with
Yep.
one station, vehemently disagree on with the other. But a good exercise would be to really listen to both sides and try to hear the bias, and try to understand when we have our own confirmation bias going on, that we can be open to hearing a different perspective, because there is not just a right and a wrong about a lot of
Mhm.
this. And there's, especially when some of the bills that have been passed, is the infrastructure bill a right or wrong thing? Well, okay, is infrastructure bad? No, great, we need roads, et cetera. But what was in that bill? Is that all infrastructure? I mean, can we talk about the process from an intellectual standpoint, from a non-emotional standpoint, and say,
Mm-hmm.
could be a better way to do this, or those kinds of things? There's always room for improvement, and that's what I'm trying to work towards. But it's not up to me to improve you. It's up to
Mm-hmm.
me to improve me.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully that will be beneficial to the encounters that I have in the world with other people.
Mm-hmm. 100%. I want to think about, as we try to improve ourselves, um, who we can look up to as role models in order to make it a more effective process in self-improvement. First of all, at the country level, is there another country's culture that you think America could learn from when it comes to civility?
Okay, that's the first. I've never been asked that question from what countries. I mean, I think there's so many countries that have so many cultures, really, that have pieces of things all the way around. But one that just came to my mind was Japan. Japan is a very polite culture.
Hmm,
Now, they could, I mean, we all know that from a wartime perspective, they're not, they're not pushovers, right?
it's
You don't
true.
have to be a doormat to be civil, but at the same time, their inherent culture is about politeness and about saving face and making sure from the other person, so not offending someone else. I mean, they take it to an nth degree, and so sometimes that's good and sometimes that's not so good, and they've had to learn. The Japanese culture has had to learn how to adjust to Western way of doing business and vice versa as we become a more global world. But I think that's all a good thing. There's nothing bad about it. There's nothing wrong about it. And so each of these cultures have a way of bringing something into that fabric that we weave together to be called society, in our global community. I think of the introductions in French letters, even in business letters, which I think over recent time has probably been diminished, just like it has in internet communications. But there was always this sort of French phrase that you put at the beginning of every letter: "My dearest, blah, 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 blah. It's my kind recommendation that you just, before you even said what you needed, there was this sort of necessary um, paragraph that just warmed everybody up and was very polite and courteous to them,
Hmm.
to say and their best wishes, etc. So the dear so and so and sincerely, all of these different things that are so simple that we take for granted sometimes, those are all part of helping us connect with. It's the glue. The word
Hmm.
protocol means glue. And so what we tried to do in protocol with these different countries is find that place where we glued our cultures together. And the rules of protocol are, I was sort of the bad protocol officer because I'm not very stuffy. I'm a pretty casual person. Whereas the
Hmm.
image of a protocol officer, I think, is somebody who's very proper. And I could name a few who I think are incredibly proper people and would never say a foul word. And my friend Leslie comes to mind,
Hmm.
Laudenslager, and who's just always just on target. I'm a little less formal. I'm a little less
Hmm.
uh, strict with my language, so you'll hear me say things that aren't so polite every once in a while in private company. But it's not about offensive to somebody, meaning tearing somebody down. It's more just, I believe that we're trying to build relationships, and it's not
Hmm.
about the rules of protocol that we needed to do. In fact, when we came to a situation where the tradition or the rule that we were supposed to follow, for example, putting the guest of honor on the right hand side of the host at a table, that would be a really simple example. When that person is seated there, what if they're deaf in their left ear?
Hmm.
So then you would say, well, that's not the right place for that person, because you want the two heads of state to have a conversation.
Sure.
So you would move that person to the other side. Well, people could say, oh, but that's, well, what my boss, a woman named Bunny Murdoch, and Lucky Roosevelt, Ambassador Roosevelt, would say is, look, the rule is there for a standardization so that we have a commonality of a way to work our way through this world. But there are reasons to break rules. There are reasons to change course. And that if they make sense, as long as you have a reason for doing it,
Hmm.
then it's applicable to change it. So it is the right thing to do. The point is to get together and have a conversation, not the right hand seat.
Sure.
It's So you have to have a little flexibility in our lives. We have to know when we need to bend, when we need to give a little to get all that much more. And this is what seems to be lost in our society. So
Mm.
with all of the different cultures, the protocol platform was about sort of getting an even playing field in a way, but we had to recognize the idiosyncrasies of each culture and adapt a bit to them. And that's what it's about. It's about adapting and going into the other culture, reaching into the other culture and grabbing that which we can relate to and pulling it into our own, and then sharing our culture with somebody in a positive way that's not imposing, that's not saying, well, this, we don't do it that way, how about sharing what you do? Then if we don't do it this way, tell me how you do it in your culture, and opening that conversation up.
Mm-hmm. Having those constructive conversations sometimes in tough moments in international relations is such an art, and there's such importance on that, on the economy, on long-term relationships between countries and people, and being able to facilitate that, like you said, putting substance above politeness or formality makes a ton of sense.
Exactly.
I'll bring it to our last question, which I believe is one of the primary inspirations for the book that you wrote, our forefather, George Washington. Why should society care about what George Washington had to say about civility? And could you explain a little bit about how George Washington played into your book?
Sure. When I lived down what they called the GW, George Washington Parkway, in Alexandria, Virginia, for many years. And it was just down the street from Mount Vernon. And George Washington Parkway ended up at Mount Vernon, which was his home. So I got to go there a number of times. And there was this book that I liked, that I collected. I collect protocol and etiquette books and things like that. And it was called George Washington's Rules of Civility. It's open source. You can go out on the internet and pull it down and print it off and things like that. 110 rules for polite behavior and decent behavior in polite society, that kind of thing. He was about 16 years old when he took those rules from a French etiquette book that was 200 years older than he was, and that was written by a monk, a French monk, who was trying to train young nobles to behave in court, how to carry themselves in the French court. Well, what I liked about what George Washington did was he sort of democratized them. He sort of said, look, this is, yes, for people to know how to conduct themselves and be gentlemen, right? But at the same time, it was not about being beholding to a nobility or a king like in the old system. I mean, we were all about democracy and not having a king. So he was sort of saying, this is good for everybody. If we can just learn to treat each other well, then we have a good chance of moving forward in this country, in this newly formed country. But he was 16. So I think it took him some time. They say that it may have been a writing exercise, but he chose that book to do, and he translated it and chose that. So it is thought that he has incorporated a lot of those behaviors and philosophies into how he behaved in his life, which was imperfect. It was an imperfect life. But whose life is perfect? We learn and grow as if we want to be people in society that are contributors to society, then we learn and grow. And this is one of the things that happened to him. And he grew to believe that slavery was wrong, and he released his slaves. He evolved as a person as he went through life. He learned and grew, and he incorporated some of those philosophies into his leadership of his people. He walked among his people. He wasn't above them. He was a hard leader. So he had to learn how to modulate that and to motivate people. I mean, these are all great leadership skills, but it isn't about perfection. It isn't about being a perfect person. It's about striving for perfection, striving for excellence in everything we do. And that goes back to basically your very first question about pride. One of your first questions about pride is having that pride in what you do and what you bring to the world. And that's what he did. That's what those rules meant to me when I read them.
Well said. It's a piece of writing that I think is going on 500 years now, but is in many ways very applicable today. Shelby, thank you so much for sharing about the work that you do and your passion around civility. I would love to turn over the floor right now to give you 60 seconds, some time to make a plug. The floor is yours.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Well, I have two themes in my life that I love to emphasize and live by, and I said them earlier: joy and civility. I think joy is the other side of the same coin as civility. Without joy in our world, we don't have much chance of civility, and without civility, joy is pretty much impossible. So I try to do that, and I hope that others might think about that. If you want to join me on that journey, you can go to shelbyscarbrough.com. If you misspell my name, it'll probably still get you there. And my book is there called Civility Rules, Creating a Purposeful Practice of Civility. There's also a book that we just published about my grandfather, who was the first aviator to attempt to fly solo around the world. And that's a really exciting,
Wow.
totally different than civility. It's more about leadership and innovation and creativity and entrepreneurship, but that's there too. So join me on that journey. I call it a joy journey, and I'd love to see you through my website and to send me a note or whatever you want to do.
So cool, Shelby. Everyone, again, the book is Civility Rules. I have it here if you're watching on YouTube. Shelby, it's been a pleasure to speak with you and learn more from you. Thank you so much for coming onto the program.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.